for other agencies. In fact, progress has now been made, and it is our database in that space which actually supports what's known as the single customer view, which again will be pivotal to the next generation of public services in terms of other agencies being able to access and validate customer identity by being able to look at this customer view. And more recently, what we have been doing is we have developed a system to capture means data, so that when we capture means data for the purpose of means assessment, we are working towards developing a system to allow that data be shared with other public bodies. So in other words, if people declare means to us and we have validated it and captured it, we will be able to share it with other public service providers where means assessments are being carried out. And obviously that potentially has huge value in other spaces, whether it be in housing or education or in health services.
Yeah. If I mean, for example, if I sort of think of, say, my caseload as a public representative, I almost never get representations in relation to child benefit, for example, and I presume that's because the system works very effectively and efficiently, and I can see it's a simpler situation than, say, job seekers or you know, something that, because there's so much change in that area. I mean, do you ever see that we will get to a stage where the likes of me as a public representative isn't going to be pursued so much on issues like job seekers or disability allowance, because the system is working so effectively that it's able to deal with people more quickly, you know, and as effectively, say, as it deals with, say, child benefit?
I would certainly hope so. I mean, certainly processing times, obviously there's a difference when somebody applies for something that relies entirely on a contribution history, where we have that history ready to hand, so we can process something very quickly. So in other words, if somebody applies for job seekers benefit, potentially that claim can be turned around and decided within a very short space of time, and that has been the experience now over in recent times. It becomes more complicated if their employment history stretches across Europe and we have to validate insurance contributions elsewhere. When you look at other schemes that we organise, obviously the other dimensions that are conditions around eligibility, for example, where it's assistance-based schemes, there's a means assessment. That takes some time. We certainly would hope that if it's a situation where somebody has previously given us means data that we can reutilise, obviously that can shortcut the process. If it's information that we can validate through another public source, again, that can shortcut the process. So, you know, we have various different opportunities available to us, I think, to try and reduce the processing times for a number of different schemes. Probably the one that has given us greatest cause for concern over the last couple of years has been where there's an additional conditionality due to medical assessment. And, you know, like, so where there's a need for somebody to either provide information for a desk assessment or even potentially, if it's a review case, to attend for in-person assessment. That can lengthen the process. What we have tried to do in that space is increase the number of medical assessors who are working in the department, change our business processes, change the kind of forms and information that we're seeking from people at initial application stage in order to try and ensure that we get the range of information that we need to make an assessment on a case. So I would hope that all of those kind of elements would lead to a situation where processing time for claims no longer becomes an issue on the political agenda.
Okay, thanks. Could I ask you about the whole area of rental allowance for people on the housing list? Because now I appreciate it's not particularly dealt with in the information that we got over the week, but it is something that has come into your remit from the Department of Health, and just I have a number of concerns, and I mean, maybe if I just outline my concerns and you respond to them, I'd appreciate that. In terms of this whole area, I mean, does the department see itself basically as just the instrument for paying out these sums of money to people on the housing list who are in private rented accommodation, or do you have any sense of a need to take an active interest in the process, for example, in seeing that the private landlords are offering a house that is fit for living in or indeed in seeing how the tenants who move in there, behave properly as tenants, or is it? Do you simply sort of see yourself as a paymaster, and is there a need, for example, for that area to be covered by maybe a responsibility on local authorities to look after that situation?
Yeah, I think that the primary focus of the department is in providing an income support to people who have a housing need, again on a short-term basis. The actual regulation of housing and oversight of housing provision is a matter for the Department of Environment. Obviously, if there are concerns about the offerings, we work very closely through the officers in the Community Welfare Service with the local authorities in terms of determining where there are problems and how they can be addressed. Equally, we have very close working relationships with the Private Residential Tenancies Board, so there's a lot of exchange of data there between ourselves and them. So our primary role absolutely is to be the paymaster. We don't have responsibility for housing per se, albeit that we work closely with the other agencies in that space.
I mean, do you think there's an argument for putting all that responsibility on, say, local authorities, for example, and that even that they become the paymasters? Because, I mean, clearly, because of the way our social housing situation has developed, an awful lot more people are living in private rented accommodation than was the case 20 years ago. And I mean, to me, it's like the system is not very satisfactory in a number of ways. And I mean, I'm not blaming. This is not. I mean, in the sense this problem has been dumped on your shoulders. But I mean, I have real concerns as to how that's the situation will pan out. And if I could tie in, and I don't know whether you have any views on this, and because I accept that it isn't entirely your area, but I think it's no harm that you're aware of it. I mean, one of my concerns in relation to this whole area is the fact that the people who bought properties to rent to others, some of those people are in serious trouble with mortgage payments, and I'm becoming aware, and I don't know how widespread this is, but I'm becoming aware that there are situations where such landlords are actually going to lose the house because of the fact that they are not paying their mortgage. So my concern in that sort of situation is what is going to happen to the tenant. That there are other situations where tenants are being told, and I don't know how widespread this in numerically, but it is a problem where, for example, that the landlord doesn't want to take anyone who is on the housing list anymore. What's going to happen to those situations, or where they simply sell the house? And has the Department of Social Protection thought out the sort of issues that may arise there? And because we're beginning, unfortunately, to move into one of the most difficult issues that this government has to deal with, namely the whole problem with people not being able to pay their mortgages and so on. And as I say, I think it's particularly acute for some people who bought multiple properties, in addition to the one they actually need themselves. So I'm just wondering, has there been any thought in that area? And also, if I'll just throw it in the lot, and then I'll sit and listen. Another concern in that area is the whole area of poverty traps, that it is very difficult for people in some of those situations to actually go out and work because they will lose the rent allowance. And I mean, is there any active work on your part in conjunction with county councils to try to progress the RAS system, the rental accommodation scheme, which puts tenants in a better position in terms of being able to go out and work and at the same time pay the rent? Sorry, I know there's a whole lot of stuff there, and I appreciate it isn't entirely on your shoulders, but I think it's an issue that we really need to grapple with, because I'm very concerned, I suppose, fundamentally, that there may be a situation where there isn't enough housing available for people on the housing list, and also to try and get people out of a situation where they're in a sort of poverty trap.
I think there's a number of different dimensions, Deputy, to the questions you raised. I mean, first of all, to confirm to you, yes, I mean, housing policy is the responsibility of the Department of Environment and the local authorities there. My understanding of government policy in this area is that we want to move back to a situation where rent supplement is a very short-term support available to people, but in fact that assistance for people who have longer-term housing needs would be delivered to a new system called the Housing Assistance Payment. And that is being designed specifically in order to reduce the perceived disincentive of the transmission, like the progress from unemployment to work or from dependence to working. So there are measures being taken to try and progress that particular policy over the course of this year. One of the things, I mean, certainly there were concerns in relation to rent supplement and about even in terms of local authority housing and in shifting people from rent supplement into RAS, about the security of the payment and the contribution of the individual. One of the things that was put in place in the most recent social welfare bill was a mandatory deduction at source facility through household budgeting system operated by An Post. So in other words, that a local authority, if it was offering a local authority house or through RAS, it would be on condition that the individual to benefit from that would sign up to a mandatory deduction of their rent, which would be payable through the household budgeting system. So that is now on a statutory basis, and we're working with the local authorities and the Department of Environment to put that into effect. Ultimately, it is about shifting to the housing assistance payment, which is a new model, which I'm not at liberty to talk to you about. It's obviously the prerogative of a different government department. In relation to the issue that you mentioned about landlords and potentially houses being sold and reducing availability of rented accommodation for people who are to benefit from rent supplement, this is something that we keep a very close monitor on. Both in the context of ensuring that the rent limits that are in place are still operable and in reviewing rent limits. So one of the things that we would take some comfort from is that I think it was somewhere in the order of 45 or 48,000 new rent supplement agreements agreed last year, which would certainly give it evidence that there was sufficient housing available or sufficient private rented accommodation available for people to avail of. And obviously the role of the community welfare service officers of my department is there to facilitate and assist and help people that if they find themselves in that kind of a situation, it's to assist them in terms of finding alternative accommodation. So that continues in place. But there is another review of the rent limits will be taken probably July, I think, of this year. So, I mean, again, this will be assessed to just ensure that the rents are operable, because there is a real issue for us in terms of those rent limits being either the push or pull factor in determining rent payable in the private sector. So there are a number of different facets, I think, all moving at the same time. There's the rent limits and our continued assessment of them. And just to ensure that there is availability of accommodation within the rent limits, within the areas, and that's on a continual basis. That's monitored by our supplementary welfare allowance colleagues in Sligo. And then there is the work that's ongoing within the Department of Environment, as I understand it, in relation to progressing to pilots of the housing assistance payment sometime later this year, and moving more people into RAS pending that.
Can I just, three other related questions to that, and then I'll move on to the other topic I want to ask about. First of all, in relation to the payments, I mean, are you aware that there seems to be a practice on some landlords of asking for, in a sense, an under-the-table payment as well, and that people who are on, say, social welfare are often in a very difficult situation where they get the rent supplement, but they are asked for a significant extra payment. And have you any views as to how that issue should be tackled? And I'll just couple of that. Could you also sort of indicate how much money actually is going from your department in this whole area as well?
I think that there's, in terms of top-up payments, there's potentially two different types. Excuse me, there is the basic idea of rent supplement, and rent supplement being payable in an instance is to ensure that somebody has sufficient money to keep themselves at a basic standard of living, in which case they'll qualify for rent supplement. But it may very well be that somebody who's potentially in receipt of rent supplement has some other income through means or through some sort of, could be rehabilitative employment or whatever. In those situations where the person has additional income above the rate of supplementary welfare allowance, it may very well be that they, if you like, the scheme allows them to top up their rent if they want to secure accommodation that's at a higher rent level than would normally be given under the rent supplement scheme. In other circumstances, if a landlord contracts under the rent supplement scheme to provide something, a tenant comes up with an arrangement with the landlord to provide at a particular rent, and that rent is underdeclared in terms of what the landlord is seeking, well, that is an offence and it should be reported to the department. And we do have specific legislation to take account of that, and our inspectors have taken additional powers in recent social welfare legislation to deal with landlords.
Sorry, just so to make sure I understand it correctly. You're basically saying that a tenant, if he or she feels they're being overcharged, they should make a formal complaint to you.
Yeah, if there has been a misdeclaration of the level of rent that's payable for the purpose of allowing an assessment, if it's been misdeclared, in other words, the landlord is seeking a rent higher than is being declared, well, then that is an offence and should be reported to us.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And sorry, the very last thing to do with this is my colleague, party colleague in my neighbouring constituency, Emmett Stagg, has been going on about the fact that in certain counties, and Kildare is a good example, it might even actually apply in Kilkenny as well, Chair, the level of rental assistance for one part of a county is not appropriate for another. I mean, for example, to take the one, I represent the Clondalkin-Lucan area, but the rental assistance in Lucan, for example, is very significantly more than it is for Leixlip, which is only a mile and a half away, but happens to be in a different county. And yet the cost of, say, renting a house in Leixlip is very significantly higher than renting a house in Athy, the other end of the county. And to what extent are you addressing that sort of issue? And I'm sure the Kildare example could be replicated in Wicklow, and other places, Meath as well, I'm sure.
What I would say, Deputy, is that there is a continuous assessment to a very detailed level of the availability of rental properties within the rent limits. I'm certainly aware of the concerns expressed by Deputy Stagg, and I understand. He has spoken to some of the people involved in the department, directly involved in providing this service, so I'm aware of that. There is
those issues going to be addressed.
Well, as I said, there's another overall review of rent limits to be undertaken in the middle of this year. But in the meantime, we continually monitor, and certainly the information that is available to us is that the rent limits can be worked as they currently exist. Obviously, that will be reviewed on a national level again in July of this year.
And are they going to be changed in those kind of situations?
Excuse me, sorry. Well, obviously, it depends on what the assessment shows at that point. I wouldn't think in previous reviews of rent limits, the rent limits have actually been reduced, reflecting the changes that have happened in the property market. I think that, I suppose, on an overall assessment, is we wouldn't expect to see too much change this year.
And sorry, the short question: how much is spent on this annually?
In 2011, there was 500 million spent on rent supplement, and in 2012, that was 423 million.
Why the big change?
The change in actual contribution that was required, and the change in rent limits.
So the tenant had to pay.
Yeah, there was two dimensions. The tenant had to pay more, and the actual rent supplement payable was reduced.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Can I just ask one quick question about community employment schemes, and that's it then. There were major changes in the whole community employment arrangements last year, some of which I can understand entirely, but there was a huge reduction in the amount of money available for what was termed materials. Now, materials in reality wasn't just things like stationery and so on. It also was used to pay things like fuel for audits and so on. Have you any sense of how that impacted on the delivery of CE schemes and the extent that it put CE schemes in difficult situations?
I think there was a lot of work done by staff of the department over the course of last year, dealing in a very close basis with CE schemes to actually assess what exactly the levels of expenditure were, where there were difficulties, and working with them to resolve those difficulties. I think in the original budget statement, there were reductions to be achieved under the training and materials grant, and subsequent to the budget announcement, it was agreed the Minister found money elsewhere within the vote to subvent that. So in a sense, the level of cutback that had originally been flagged when we carried out the assessment, we didn't have to enforce that level of cutback at that time during 2012. What it certainly allowed us to do, because there was a very extensive review undertaken of all CE schemes on the financial basis, it identified various areas where there were savings to be achieved. For example, in insurance, like that, there were different arrangements by different schemes. There were other savings to be achieved where we actually potentially could amalgamate schemes to get better efficiencies, or indeed that we could increase the ratio within the agreements that were in place, increase the ratio of participants to supervisors to get greater benefit from the expenditure that was being made. And indeed to secure, in terms of delivering better value on the monies available for training, there were arrangements put in place to secure better, more cost-effective training solutions for many of those involved in the schemes.
Did that apply to audits as well?
Pardon?
Did that apply to audits?
Yes, sorry, insurance audits, I beg your pardon, insurance audits, training, and as I say, the kind of ratio of participants to supervisors. In some areas there was opportunities for us to make progress there. The net effect of all of that is that we managed to achieve savings on our community employment programme spend, while at the same time putting in place better financial foundations and structures for further delivery over the course of the next number of years. And no scheme had to close on foot of the measures that were put in place, although there were some changes, as I say, because there were some amalgamations. But there was no schemes actually impacted to the extent that they had to close.
Okay, thanks.
I want to welcome Mr. Donoghue and our colleagues. I just want to touch on two areas. The first area is, you said you have three main functions: delivery, income support, activation, control of fraud. And I want to go back really to the issue on fraud. And any system has to give the appearance of being fair. So it's kind of developing slightly on previous teams, but a couple of questions I suppose I'd like to ask. How much did you recover on fraud in 2012? In terms of fraud, in terms of investigations in respect to fraud, how much did you recover value-wise?
Deputy, I'm afraid that when we recover money, it's recorded in our overpayment system, and as the Controller has previously referred, one of the problems we have with our current system is that it doesn't differentiate between recoveries against error payments or fraudulent payments. It is a recovery against a debt that's on our system, so I can't give you that breakdown. I'm afraid.
I know I'm probably going up. What was the total amount you recovered in 2012?
We recovered 51 million, I think, in 2011.
And that would be out of a total budget of about 21 billion. Total budget of 21 billion.
Total expenditure of 21 billion, yes.
And how much of you spent on of the 51 million you recovered, the total payments that would relate to, how much would they be in value terms?
Well, it is overpayments to the value of 92 million were recorded in 2011, and we recovered 51 million.
And how much would be the total spend in that overall in terms?
That's across
that's over the 21 billion.
Yes.
Okay, but of the 21 billion, would that include administration as well? No. That wouldn't be administration costs to the department.
It's included in the 21 billion, yes.
Yeah, but how much in terms of social welfare payments? What's the total value of that figure?
The entire cost of administration in the department is about 600,000 or 600 million.
So
it's roughly about 3%, 4%. So everything else is programme spend.
So roughly about 20 billion is spent on thereabouts is spent on
schemes.
On
yes.
schemes, and of that, 92 million in total
was recorded as overpayment.
Was recorded, which would be what would be.
It's less than 0.5% of expenditure. It's 0.44% of expenditure.
It seems very, very low.
Well, in order to decide on an overpayment and record it, because once it's recorded, it becomes a debt. Obviously, there has to be an evidence base that an overpayment occurred.
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm going down to tack. I suppose the line, I've brought it up before and I'm going to bring it up again. The CWOs transfer from, they were always paid, funded through the Department of Social Welfare, but they operated under the HSE. How many of those transferred into your department?
There was,
when did they transfer?
They transferred on secondment from the 1st of January 2011 and substantively from the 1st of October 2011.
So
there's approximately 1,000 staff, of which about 700 or so were CWOs.
How many of those CWOs have been assigned to investigation and fraud?
Well, what I could say to you is, I mean, basically everybody has a control and fraud brief. There are, in the last year, 600 additional warrants have been issued to staff in the department, but bear in mind that we've had 1,000 staff come in from the HSE, we've had 700 staff come in from FOSS, employment services and community employment programmes, and we've had additional staff redeployed in.
I want to be very specific here. Okay. In my experience as a public rep, no one has the intelligence that the CWOs have. Okay. They're dealing with people on the ground, right? They're administering the rent supplement scheme, right? They know what's going on. They're the people we deal with in a lot of cases in terms of frontline. Cannot understand why a significant portion of those were not put into inspection and fraud.
Well, I think, sorry, Deputy, what I'm trying to say is inspection and fraud control is part of their function now. If I can clarify, we have activation control teams operating.
I'm going to be very direct now on this. My understanding is there isn't as many people involved in that whole area of inspection as there was last year, we'll say in 2011 versus 2012. And the question I'm asking is that you can have all the systems in the world, but it relies on intelligence. It relies on whether people are abusing their rent supplement scheme. It applies on whether, and that's about intelligence. CWOs have that in abundance because they are the first line of call. If they are going for an application to the Department of Social Welfare, their first protocol after that is the CWO. They're on the ground. They're going down into the health centres. They're going down into community centres. And if we're pulling back less than 0.5% in terms of fraud, and the point I'm trying to make here is I have a fundamental belief is a system should be fair. I have a fundamental belief that if people are entitled to be paid social welfare, they're perfectly entitled, and they're not receiving by any means a fortune. But at the same time, there is a perception amongst the general public, and there is a perception amongst a lot of people on social welfare, that there are people abusing the system. I would expect, if it's 0.44%, and I think you would probably accept, Mr. Donoghue, it clearly is probably higher than that figure. To enable that to happen, you need to put in specialist people. You need to put in people that can devote their attention to inspections. If you've a general person and they're working on a file, we'll say that's the rate of fraud, and then they're pulled away to the counter, there is no way that they can devote their attention specifically to that purpose. And I would have thought there was an enormous opportunity when the CWOs came over to effectively use their intelligence to put in place a crack team that would give comfort to the general public and comfort to the vast majority, if not nearly all the people that are on social welfare, that are genuine recipients, that that the system was working. And in a lot of cases, the general public believe that that system, in terms of abuse of social welfare, that there is large-scale abuse going on. And the question I'm asking is, I'm talking about personnel. I'm not talking about systems. Control Knowledge General has made reference to that. I'm talking about cold, hard slog, foot soldiers on the ground with an intelligence network that's unrivaled, in my view.
I agree with you, Deputy, and what I was trying to say to you is that since the CWOs came into the department, what we have been doing is emphasising their control brief. They have been working as part of joint teams with our inspectors, particularly on different projects, specifically based on intelligence and information identified through the CWOs. We have, where we have run out intro offices and integrated offices, CWOs are part of the integrated decision team. So again, are feeding in their intelligence in terms of fraud and control in that space. And we have taken very significant training in terms of emphasising the control dimension and the need for greater exchange of information and intelligence across all streams in the department. That has been happening. It has been happening on the ground. I'm not going to be personal
here, right? But then explain to me why only 51 million was recovered in fraud out of a budget of nearly 20 billion in social welfare payments.
Because we have to have the evidence to support it, Deputy. I mean, by the same token, I would point to you that there were over 1 million reviews of claims, or 100,000 reviews of claims last year. I have given information to the committee in relation to very targeted investigations that are going on about using data in a much more intelligent way to target specific areas where we think there is a potential for fraud, and reviewing claims on that basis.
Do you believe that your systems at the moment are working in terms of coming up with an accurate figure in terms of social welfare fraud?
I don't think, what I have to operate on is the basis of evidence, and absolutely we can continually improve our system, which is precisely the point that we were in terms of looking at non-compliance analytics, looking at how we can marry our intelligence together in a better way to target better the level of fraud.
How many extra social welfare inspectors have been put on specifically to deal with inspection and fraud?
What I would specifically within we have about 90 odd staff who are working full-time on fraud out of people who are working full-time on control of about somewhere in the order of 600 staff. But that is within what would have been core DSP activity. In addition, we have staff within the Community Welfare Service, and we have staff within the employment services who are contributing to control activity.
You're saying that there's 90 people nationally looking specifically at the issue of serious
fraud. On serious fraud. That's in our SIU, our Serious Investigation Unit.
Where would they be based?
They're nationally.
And the 600 then, they would be what?
They would be staff, including the inspectors who are in our local office network. They would be staff within the scheme areas, the centralised scheme areas. There would be staff within our control division who are data matching. You know, there's a myriad of different staff who are involved in this.
How many social welfare officers would you have nationally at this particular point?
Many social offices?
Yes.
There are, between local offices, we have about 60. We have about 60 employment offices, and there's about 60 branch offices.
There was 90 people that are involved in the Special Investigative Unit. Where would they be based?
They're attached to regions, Deputy. Okay. It's a national unit headed by a principal officer
level.
How
many regions would there be?
There's 13 divisions on a regional basis.
So roughly you're talking about 7 or 8 people per region.
But they're working on serious fraud, and they're working with, as well, following on from targeting by the inspectors and control staff into serious fraud investigation. And they also work with, but they also work with other agencies like Revenue, like NERA, in relation to employer inspections.
And how do those numbers, will say, is that number 90 at the end of obviously 2012 and currently? How would those numbers compare with what would have been in place, we'll say, for 2011 and 2010?
It's broadly consistent. It's the same.
But can I ask, why haven't you put extra people into that area? Because it's an area that comes up every time you come before the PAC. Not in the PAC very long, but it's an issue that has come up every time. And it's an issue, I've no doubt if you read back on my script from last year, it's probably relatively similar. And our job in the PAC, it's not personal, but our job in the PAC is to get value for the taxpayer. And if you have a situation where fraud is going on, and clearly if you have less than 1%, less than 0.5% of your overall spending is what's being captured in respect of, we'll say, abuse of the system. And I think it's very important that we distinguish between the genuine inadvertent overpayments from fraud, and I think it will be extremely important, and I know the Controller has made reference to it, that we distinguish that.
Indeed.
Because there are cases where it's a genuine case. But the point I'm making here is that with the large increase in social welfare payments, with the fact that you had 1,000 extra CWOs coming in October 2011, I would have thought the opportunity there was to put extra staff, to increase the complement of 90, to specifically set up a targeted, we'll say, area of fraud, and because it's something that the general public look in at. We are conscious of it every day of the week. So can you just explain that to me?
Okay, Deputy, I mean, our job, as I was saying, is to provide a whole range of different services, and obviously control of fraud is one of those, and control and investigation of serious fraud is a smaller dimension of that.
You're spending taxpayers' money.
Absolutely, we're spending taxpayers' money. Sorry, I'm in no doubt about our responsibilities in this space. But if I could explain, I also have a responsibility to deliver income support services. I also have a responsibility to deliver activation services. And I have to balance between the three. And I have to do that in a context where we're governed by an overall employment control framework, which is obviously government policy in relation to reducing numbers in the public service. We have benefited from that in terms of being the beneficiaries of redeployees into vacancies that existed within the department. But what we have to try and do is balance the number of resources that we have while delivering the full range of services that we always had to deliver, including the full range of CWO services that had to be delivered, in a context where the number of staff is reducing over time. Within that context, I would say, is that we have maintained the numbers involved in serious fraud investigation. And what we have worked to do is try and ensure that the supports and the targeting of that serious fraud investigation becomes much more refined so that we get much better effect. Absolutely, I would like to be able to put more people into that area, but that would mean taking them out of some other area.
Can I just to conclude on this, of the 90 people that are involved in the Special Investigative Unit, how many of those came from the CWOs of the 1,000 that were transferred in?
I don't have that figure to hand, I'm afraid, Deputy.
But have you an idea, have any been transferred into that area?
Yes. Yeah.
You think some have?
Yes.
And my point really is we're on the same page here, right? And I'm strong on this point because I genuinely believe that it's not just about, it's very difficult when you're cutting back on spending to people on a range of services. And at the same time, they see that fraud is occurring, right? And I just asked that to take on board the Controller General that it's an area that you would look at to come up with to find a way that when you're back here next year that the level of detection is higher.
Well, I certainly would hope that we would be in that situation, Deputy, because as I say, everything we're doing is to try and improve the value from the effort that we put into this place. Certainly what I would say to you is that as we move to more integrated activity, as we rationalise some of the services that CWOs are currently giving, it does free up resources for us to deploy them. More CWOs will become more fully involved in control activity, if I can put it like that. But every CWO has a control responsibility as well as their basic responsibility. In the same way as I think I made the point to one of your colleagues earlier, control activity begins at point of claim. So every deciding officer in the department has a control dimension to their role, and we have been reinforcing this very heavily over the last year or so.
Final point then, slightly changing. when you look at the profile of payments, the one payment that's going up consistently every year is state pensions. And since 2000, over the last 4 years, they have risen by 17% in terms of the amount paid. And we have an ageing population. We have exposure in terms of the social insurance fund. So have you done analytical analysis on this area in terms of projecting how this area can be addressed? Because there clearly is shortfalls. I'm just looking down through it. The rest, a lot of them are variables, a lot of them are very consistent, our payments over the last 4 years. But the one area that's going up every year consistently is state pensions.
Well, there's been a number of different analyses done in relation to pensions, Deputy, and the most recent referenced in the Controller's report was the actuarial review of the Social Insurance Fund, which highlights the problems that are there. Obviously, government has taken, from a policy perspective, has taken some decisions, and changes have been made in relation to the pensions regime, both in terms of the age at which somebody can qualify for pension, indeed in relation to the future of state transition pension, and indeed even in terms of the type of benefits that people can get now in terms of the introduction of new rates relative to the
as General
contributions.
Secretary of the Department, not asking you on a policy issue, but as General Secretary of the Department, have you an observation on the way the profile of in terms of demographics, have you a general observation on that area of your own, as distinct from a government policy area?
Given the demographic profile of the population, is that the cost of state pension under the current structure will continue to increase. I mean, it is the report of the actuarial review last summer was consistent with the review 5 years ago. There is a difficulty there, which is what influenced the changes, I think, that were introduced to the structure of pension, and further changes may be required. There are a number of different elements being looked at. I mean, the OECD is looking at pensions policy at the behest of the Minister at the moment. It's expected that report will be made very shortly, and that should help influence future policy determination in relation to pensions. But that's specifically to take account of the fact that there is an imbalance there. We have an ageing population that is ageing. The kind of dependency ratio between those in work and those who will be dependent on pension will change, and that kind of life expectancy issues and birth rates are all highlighting the fact that there is a problem there for the future unless something is done.
Very much so.
Sorry, if I could just correct you, it's been clarified for me that while we have had a number of CWOs move into different roles in the department, there's no CWOs yet in the SIU, but obviously there are CWOs working in control. Sorry, just as a point of clarification.
To reiterate, and I don't wish just to reiterate my point, right?
Oh, well, sorry, if I could just finalise, we are currently running a competition. Sorry, because people who work in SIU, it attracts an allowance. There's a competition being organised at the moment, and that is open to CWOs, obviously, to participate in that.
An observation? I think it's a grave mistake that they're not involved in that area.
Well, it's a competitive process, Deputy.
Yeah,
so
if you're missing my point.
No, sorry.
No, you're missing.
I'm not. Sorry.
Let me make my point. You have 90 people involved in SIU for the last number of years. Clearly, it's not having the impact in terms of if the levels of fraud detection are at 0.44% of the overall spend. I'm on the public record on this. I would have felt there was an opportunity in terms of a strategic direction when the CWOs came over as a group, that the skill sets they have for a number of reasons. Number one, they were the group effectively administering rent supplement, which is social welfare payment. They're on the ground. They know the people. And I'm amazed at this moment in time that none of the CWOs are involved in the area. I would hope, and I know you're saying it's open competition, but surely this is about using the skill set at your disposal.
And Deputy, I will get back to my point. It is absolutely about using the skill sets to inform what we do in the area of fraud, and that is happening in terms of integrated control teams on the ground. It is happening in relation to joint operations between inspectors and CWOs, and it's happening in relation to the feeding of intelligence that helps inform the targeting of SIU activity. There are no CWOs currently in the SIU team, but that will change. I'm pretty confident that will change on the basis of this competition. But it is a question of actually trying to balance resources across the full range of activity of the department, including the serious fraud investigation.
This is not personal. I'm saying this purely on the basis that the ordinary person looking in there, both the genuine social welfare recipient, who are the vast greater majority, if not nearly all, and the person, the general public, the system and the fraud side, the detection rate of 0.44% is just too low.
Well, what I would say to you is it's 90 odd staff in serious fraud control. There are over 600 staff that are engaged full-time in control activity, which represents 10% of the staff of the department, in addition to every officer who's involved in processing claims, in deciding on claims, having a controlled dimension to their work. So I can assure you that in the same way as we take very seriously our obligation to try and process and get somebody into payment who is eligible for a payment as quickly as possible, equally we take our responsibility to try and ensure that those who are not entitled to payment are either stopped at point of entry or indeed discovered and detected very quickly.
You'll appreciate that when you look at the figures and you see 51 million out of a budget of over 20 billion, you have to ask questions in terms of detection.
I have to operate on the basis of evidence, Deputy. So where the evidence will show or can indicate on foot of an investigation that a fraud has occurred, action will be taken.
But equally, I have to act in evidence as well, and the evidence is telling me, in terms of cold hard facts, that 0.44% of the overall social welfare budget was the amount that was collected in respect of overpayments and frauds. We don't even have the distinction.
No, sorry, it's fraud. It's fraud as a proportion. It's 4.44% is the overpayment that's attributed to fraud as a proportion of the budget.
What's the value of that? That's 51 million, is it?
Sorry, it is 34.9 million in 2011.
So 34.9. So you're talking about roughly about what, nearly 2/3 of the overpayments.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, Deputy. I may have given you an incorrect figure, or I may have misunderstood what you were asking.
Yeah.
Overpayments in their totality, the 92 million, equated to 0.44% of expenditure.
That's the overpayments
in total.
So
the fraudulent element of that relates, it's 0.2% of expenditure.
Well, then it's even, unfortunately, we're half, so 0.2, and that's 34.9. So that means 1/3 of the overpayments was fraud, and only 0.2% of the overall social welfare budget was attributed, the overpayment was attributed to fraud.
Yes.
It's just too low. It's just, on an evidence system, right, it's just too low. And I'd ask that it's something that you would look at again in line with the Control Order General.
Well, absolutely, Deputy. I can assure you that we are continually looking at ways of improving any detection, but we must base whatever decisions we make on the evidence presented.
Accept that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming along and for your preparation for the meeting. And also, as some of my colleagues have said, I know that your staff are doing very, very difficult work in trying circumstances. And I just want to acknowledge that, particularly a lot of the community welfare officers that Deputy O'Donnell referred to do great work in trying times, and that has to be acknowledged here in our session this morning. I will return back to the fraud bit in a moment, but I do want to shift tack slightly to an issue that was touched in your opening statement, which is the pathways to work and the work that you are leading in relation to activation. And a statistic that was referred to by one of my colleagues earlier regarding the number of people that didn't turn up for interviews with the relevant official. and the statistic that was made available is that 1 in 4 people didn't turn up for an interview with their inspector or official in the relevant office. Could you confirm if that figure is still valid, or if there is more up-to-date information in relation to it?
Deputy, I can say to you, I'm just waiting for one of my colleagues to give me the exact figures, but I can say to you that in the main, what our experience has been is that people are contacted and arranged to come for an interview. A proportion don't come attend at the first time of asking. What we find is that when, and in many cases, that's often for very good reason. We invite those who don't attend a second time of asking, and the actual level of engagement rapidly increases at second time of asking. So if I could just break this down to you.
And indeed, if you would have the figures for both times of asking, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, no, sorry, that's not it. But what we do have is a situation where people do leave the register, people find work, people commence training or education courses. There are very valid reasons as to why people don't attend when they're asked. Sorry about this.
No problem.
Okay, sorry, I beg your pardon. Since the introduction of operational instructions in this regard in the middle of 2012, 15,807 customers referred to activation, 5,338 initially failed to attend. Okay,
so that's give us those figures again, please.
807.
807. So just to clarify, these were people who were invited in for an interview.
Yes.
Or more than invited.
During a particular period.
Okay. And what was that period, please?
June and July, 2-month period following the introduction of new arrangements.
And
okay?
just if we can clarify, I assume what you're referring to in relation to the new arrangement, this was the idea that if people don't turn up on a number of occasions, there is a sanction in relation to that. So just that we have all the context.
Absolutely.
So this request was put out there, and it was made clear to people that if they did not engage in the process, they could lose part of their payment.
Yeah.
So 15,807 people were asked to turn in.
Yeah.
How many didn't, and how many
didn't? For the initial engagement, 5,338 failed to attend. Okay. Following a further invitation and the warning, as you indicate, in terms of the consequences of non-engagement, of the 5,338, just 308 failed to attend the second engagement, second scheduled appointment. And in relation to those, when those cases were examined by deciding officers, penalty rates were imposed on 52 of those 308.
Okay. So you had an improvement then of nearly 5,000 cases between round 1 and round 2. And what was the difference between round 1 and round 2 in terms of the message that went out to people?
Well, it would have been a sterner warning about the consequences of non-engagement.
Okay.
If I could explain, Deputy, people are invited to come for an appointment. It may not suit their family circumstances for a whole range of situations, and they may not necessarily understand that there is a consequence to non-engagement. So what we did was revise the kind of communications that we have with members of the public so that they're much clearer about what we expect of them and what the consequences of non-engagement will be.
Okay. But that's quite a remarkable change in performance from prior to this system being introduced. The information that I have seen indicated that a quarter of people did not turn up. And you're saying here, after the introduction of the system, of the 15,807 people that were required to come in, only around 500 did not come in the end.
I think, Deputy, if like previously, before the new systems were put in place, there was a process of referral under the National Employment Action Plan, the NEAP, which meant that somebody who was on the live register for 3 months or more was referred to an interview with Force Employment Services as it was then. And the kind of figures that you're mentioning, I think, would have come from analysis of the level of engagement under that particular programme. What we're doing now, what we have been doing, obviously, since the responsibility for Force Employment Services transferred into the department, is first of all ratchet up very considerably the level of engagement that we have with people joining the live register. And what we have also, obviously, the circumstances in terms of the introduction of the penalty regime has influenced, but also just the expectation of engagement has changed as well. In other words, previously somebody entering the live register would not have expected and wouldn't have had, there would have been no particular reason to expect to be called for an interview other than a signing on process. Whereas now somebody who comes into a new intro office, they're profiled immediately, they're scheduled for a group engagement session depending on the profile that emerges from the profiling data that has been taken. That group engagement session can happen within a matter of days or weeks. Following on from that, there are one-to-one interviews, and following on from that, there's a progress. So it's a much more intensive engagement. And
could you just give me that second round figure again in terms of the number of people who failed to attend?
Of the sorry, I beg your pardon, of the
5338.
With 5338, during this 2-month period, of the 5338 who failed to attend the initial interview,
sure.
When they were given the warning, just 308 failed to attend.
Failed to attend.
Yeah.
And out of the 308, how many penalties were then?
Rates were imposed in 52 cases.
52, okay. And out of the other 256 people, what would have happened to them?
I don't have detailed information, but it could be very well the situation that I said. People would have found work, or maybe have started training, or have taken up places in other schemes or whatever.
And that was June, July 2012?
In July of 2012.
And has that process been repeated since then?
I don't have figures for it, but yeah, that's on a continuous basis, absolute ongoing basis, and we are. I mean, what we're trying to do at the moment is we're examining the use of the penalty rates and see is there any way in which that whole scheme and that whole mechanism can be enhanced even further, particularly in the context of people who are engaged in various other activation schemes or supports. Like so that if somebody is referred, for example, for participation in a TOO scheme or a community employment scheme or whatever, that there can be a penalty regime attached to their non-engagement in that process. But I understand that will require legislation for us to extend it, but we're actually looking at that at the moment.
But the process that took place across June and July is ongoing.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Given that that was 8 or 9 months ago, would it be possible for you to supply to us more recent figures, just so we can gain an understanding of how this is developing? Because if you look at one of the conclusions from the Controller and Auditor General regarding, activation, looking at the issue of fraud, if you look at the discussion that Deputy O'Donnell has just had there with you, a major part of preventing from all this happening again, is intensive engagement with people who are receiving benefits. And in the exchange you've just given me, you're saying here that across this period here, after the new system was put in place, there was a big difference in the results versus where we were beforehand.
But I think that works two ways, Deputy, if I may. Absolutely, there's a control dimension to it, but it's equally about trying to assist people get themselves back on their feet. It's about trying to assist them in terms of progression plans and trying to assist them in terms of places or activation.
And I think we would all say that and Deputy O'Donnell said that on a number of occasions. We all know that the people who receive these payments, in many cases, they don't want to be receiving them. They would rather be at work, that they'd rather be leading a different life, and the absolute overwhelming majority of people are receiving them honestly and for good reason. Just to interrogate this a bit more then, just to go to page 2 of your opening statement where you talked about the Pathways to Work scheme. In your statement you said that it's been rolled out to 10 offices last year with a target of another 33 this year, with full completion by end of 2014. Could you give us an understanding here, if this is the offices, roughly how many people now have been affected by the new scheme that we've been discussing here?
In terms of the customers of those offices,
yeah.
I don't have that figure to hand, Deputy, but
Okay.
it's such. Apparently, it's about 13% coverage of the live register within those 10 offices.
Today.
Yeah, I mean, let's say, for example, 2 of the offices would be very significant: Tala, King's Inns.
I know King's Inn Street,
yeah,
and it's been, even the design and layout of it is fundamentally
Yeah.
changed.
So, and obviously that will considerably ramp up by the end of this year with the additional 33. That will give us at least 50%